Okay, hey everyone, it's Shermy here. Just wanted to talk through a Barbarian build quick. So, I've been streaming for a couple days now with some various different builds that are not Whirlwind on Barbarian, mostly just to kind of see what other options are out there. So, I wanted to talk through one here because I'm about to change it and I wanted to make sure we memorialized it so everyone could see what it is, how it works, and maybe it's something interesting to try it out. So first question, why would you be on anything that isn't Whirlwind? The answer, I guess there's two reasons for that. One, everyone's on Whirlwind. That's probably going to be pretty boring, especially because I suspect people are going to be on Whirlwind for a very long time. So it gives you something else to do, right? The other option then would be depending on what kind of gear you get. So for example, I've gotten this unique a couple times now already, Fields of Crimson. This wants you to be using Rupture, and Rupture kind of wants you to be on Bleed. Bleed wants you to be on things that aren't Whirlwind, and so you just kind of end up on something different, right? So I want to talk through what I've got here. What I actually have here is what I'm calling the Shoutless Barbarian. You may notice, like I said, there are no shouts on my bar. So let's kind of talk through what this build looks like. So first off, this isn't really item dependent. I mean, it kind of is, but it isn't. I would not run this without Fields of Crimson personally, but I can see you just using it because you want to. No one's stopping you. There's no reason you couldn't. The only thing is you're going to miss that big blood pool from Rupture that Fields of Crimson gives you, which is going to make it a lot harder for you to be able to handle large groups of enemies all at once. But let's go ahead and go through the skills. That's really the important part, right? So, looking at our skill tree here, first thing is our basic. I'm on Flay. So most people are on Lunging Strike right now, and I don't think that's necessarily wrong. And honestly, you could use Lunging Strike with this build too. In fact, Lunging Strike has a node that causes bleed damage. Most people, or a lot of people, are using the Berserking option, but actually the bleed option is pretty typical, and that would work just fine for this build. The main reason I'm not on it is because I want to get used to playing without using Lunging Strike. One, because I suspect it might get changed since that's like the default for everyone right now. And two, I mean, it's just something different. Flay does technically do more damage, though a lot of it is bleed. So I like using it as well. And really, I don't think the lunge from Lunging Strike is like necessary for Barbarian. It feels nice, but I don't think it's like required. So anyway, we're on Flay. Obviously, we have the enhanced, and then I put it on Battle Flay, so they're taking extra bleeding damage from me, as opposed to the other option where they give, damage reduction in the thorns. As we go here then for our core skill, I'm using Rend. Rend is again because I'm leaning into Bleed because I want to make use of Rupture, and we'll get to that in a second. Could you use something else here? I don't see why you couldn't, but I would probably stick with Rend, just because Bleed is going to be really important for what we're doing later. But anyway, so Rend is the big bleed core skill. It's going to take a big chunk of damage out of someone, but then do a huge chunk of bleeding damage. But bleed is over time. It's a dot. We did enhance it, so that means it does extend the duration of vulnerable on enemies we hit with it. And it does massive extra damage to enemies with vulnerable. The other option here is to have it refund some fury for you. I talked about this a bit on my stream, but basically, if you look at the math behind this, this takes you from being able to do 2, sometimes 3, depending on your shouts or other generators, Rens back to back, as opposed to with this node, you'd have 6 Rens back to back. However, with this sort of build, you're not sitting there spamming Ren. What you're doing is you're kind of weaving different skills together, kind of like in a rotation, like you would in like an MMO. So because of that, you don't need the ability to just smash Ren a bunch. And really, I don't know. I don't think that'd be correct to do. So I don't think that's necessary, and I would not make that choice. There's a passive here we took. This pressure point. I do think pressure point's probably going to be something you want on every Barbarian. Giving us that extra vulnerable of your core skills is going to be really big. Vulnerable is a great damage multiplier, and basically everyone wants it where they can get it. Now then, where it gets interesting because we don't have shouts. So normally on Barbarian, what you'd see is like 5 points in Rallying Cry, 1 to 5 points in Challenging Shout, maybe a point in War Cry, and then all of the shout passes built up. We did not do that here. What we did is we're leaning into Leap and Ground Stomp. There are some legendaries we'll go through in a bit that basically make these two work together really well, and that's why we decided to try and lean into them. We just want to try something different. So looking at Ground Stomp here, Ground Stomp, so it does an amount of damage and it stuns enemies. Obviously we want to enhance it, that makes it last a little bit longer, and then we have two options. We have the ability to make it be a Fury Generator, or we can make it take cooldown off of your ultimate. For me, I went with a Fury Generator because we don't have shouts, and that's one of the main reasons you're using shouts is to generate Fury, because generally your basic skill isn't going to be enough to keep up with your Fury costs. Personally, I think that was fine, and Ground Stomp is interesting. So the fact that it stuns things, in practice, that's going to work a lot better than it reads. When you use it, it's kind of like, so you'll notice when you shout around enemies, they kind of stagger a little bit. Ground Stomp does kind of the same thing, though admittedly in a smaller area. But if you are fighting like an elite and you Ground Stomp right next to them, there's a pretty good chance of you actually knocking them prone on the ground, which is a much longer stun. It's really quite effective, surprisingly so. And our legendaries can make Ground Stomp really powerful, and we'll get to that in a second. While we're still looking at this note here, we do have some passes filled out. We did take Outburst. This is giving us some thorns, and then some extra thorns for more life we have. This is mostly because I wanted some more defensive options, because losing Challenging Shout was going to make us very, very squishy, so I wanted to make sure we had more ways of staying alive without burning skills. And then we also have Tough as Nails here, which just a further increase to our thorns. And it actually makes enemies bleed when they attack us as well, so we're feeding into this bleeding build that we're working on. Going to our next note here, the only thing we filled out here is Leap. So Leap is a movement skill. It lets you jump pretty long distances, and then when you land, you deal some damage. It has a little bit of knockback, so it's kind of another way to stun things. Just kind of keeps you moving around. If it doesn't hit anything, it's going to refund the cooldown by some amount of time, and as long as it hits anything, it is a Fury Generator, and that's from our increases here, our bonuses on Leap. So you'll see, again, when we look through our legendaries, that these two kind of feed into each other, and that's why I wanted them both on my bar. And then the other spot where we could have had maybe one shout is where we're kind of sold into Rupture, and that's really what the whole build is around, is Rupture. So let's look at Rupture then. So you see I have 12 ranks in it right now. 7 of that's coming from my items. We'll go through that in a bit. But basically, any skill can actually cap out at 15, even though you can put 5 into it. So you'll see here, I am actually getting some benefit out of it being overcapped, but most of that's coming from items. But anyway, what is Rupture doing? So it basically stabs a person in front of me, and then when I pull my my sword out, basically the end of the animation, any bleed they have going on is immediately cashed in. So normally bleed is a 5-second dot. What this will do is it'll immediately take all that dot off, and they'll just take all that damage right away, and then it reapplies bleed to them. Additionally, with the upgrades I have it actually healing me as well when I do that. And trust me, 15% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you see it in practice, it's quite significant. The other option there would be increasing my attack speed. Talked about this on stream a bit as well, but basically, with the way this build works, you're not going to be basic attacking a whole lot. And even when you are, the attack speed isn't really going to be super relevant for you. So I would stick with the life gain here. Beyond that, we have a bunch of passives filled out in this area. So we have Hamstring maxed out, which is enemies that are bleeding are slowed by 30%, and then we also have Cut to the Bone maxed out, so we're dealing a bunch of extra damage to vulnerable enemies. So again, we're focusing on making things vulnerable, extending that vulnerable, and then doing a bunch of extra crit damage and normal damage to those vulnerable enemies. It's going to be kind of this feedback loop into itself throughout this build. We also have 3 ranks in Pit Fighter. Deal more damage to enemies that are close, and take less damage from enemies that are far. This is so basic to Barbarians. If you think about what a Barbarian is, right, you have no options that aren't melee. So everything you're going to be doing once, well, what this is, it wants you to be doing more damage to things that are close, and you want to take less damage to guys that are shooting you from a distance. So I think when we get into like Season 1, when builds start really solidifying, we're going to see basically every single Barbarian is going to have 3 points in Pit Fighter. I don't think you can get around it. I think it really is that important. Beyond that, I have just 1 point each, 1 in No Mercy. It's a little bit of extra crit strike against enemies that are immobilized, stunned, or slowed. We are doing a bunch of stunning, so that makes sense, as well as slows from hamstring. And then for exposed vulnerability, again, we're doing what we're doing is we're feeding into the vulnerable loop by making our core skill, which is our rend, make enemies vulnerable. And remember, it also extends the length of vulnerable with other options we put on it as well. Down to the ult node, we do have one passive here, heavy-handed. Most Barbarians, unless you're doing the weapon swapping build, is going to be leaning into one of your two-handers. So heavy-handed here, I think, is another one you'll see every Barbarian take 3 of it. For our ult, we've gone with Wrath of the Berserker. Basically, Iron Maelstrom doesn't do anything for us because we don't want to be weapon swapping. And Call of the Ancients kind of doesn't really do what this build needs. It's not so worried about, handling a whole room at once, which is what Call's really good at. It just wants to be strong. So Wrath basically just makes us berserk, makes us unstop, makes us move faster, gives us a fury generator. It just does all of the things. It just makes you really strong all at once for a few seconds, which is really all you need out of an ult in this build. And finally, what's our key passive? So the majority of people are building around Unbridled Rage for things like Whirlwind. Makes your core skills very, very powerful, but makes them cost a lot. Now, if we were running Unbridled Rage, that's where I'd want something like the option on Rend to make it give Fury back. But because we're not doing that, we don't need all that much in Fury generation, so what we have is fine. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to lean into our Bleed and make us do a whole bunch of crit damage to bleeding targets. I'm not as worried about the overpower. We're not really building into Fortify terribly, but the extra crit damage against bleeding enemies is extremely noticeable, and that's why I have this key passive selected here. So that's kind of what we look like on skills. Paragon board-wise, I'm only into my second board right now. I'm not even on the board where I think this is going to get the biggest, which is going to be like the next board I'll probably put Disembowel on, which is really going to make this build shine. For now, I just have a basic starter board, and I have Exploit on there, and then I have I forgot the name of this board, but I have Marshall in there. If you go to maxroll.gg, I use their guides to help make sure I'm on the right path with some of my builds. I'm just using the basic Paragon board setup they have for their endgame Barbarian builds. I would check those out. Those seem to be pretty good paths, and it seems like they're doing a pretty good job there. But I'm sure we'll see better options or more optimized options as we get closer to Season 1. So anyway, we mentioned a lot that gear does sort of matter for this, or at least what affixes you have. So obviously, like I said, I've got Fields of Crimson going, which is making a big difference in how my Rupture works. I would really encourage you to look for this or try and get this before you go into specifically a Rupture build. Without this, I would frankly, if you still want to do this without Rupture, I would swap Rupture out for Deathblow, and then I would cut the Bleed entirely for Lunging Strike, and then probably, if not Whirlwind, I don't know if Whirlwind would work terribly well because you don't have a lot of Fury. I would probably do like Upheaval. Could do Hoda. Hoda's going to be pretty expensive too. I would look at Upheaval because then you have some range as well. Anyway, so that's that. I do have Mother's Embrace on as well. This is from the Beating the Campaign. You'll get this as guaranteed drop. This is not necessary for the build, but it gives you some comfort. So here is our first affix that really matters for the build. Reducing the cooldown of Leap by 4 seconds. It doesn't really matter. We're reducing the cooldown of Leap based on enemies hit up to a maximum of 9 seconds. This is a big deal because, again, we're looping Leap and Stomp for the majority of our Fury generation as well as a lot of our effects that we have going forward. For our Amulet here, this is another big one. If you have Kick or Ground Stomp, it'll reset Leap's cooldown. So what basically you're going to do here is you're going to leap on enemies, Depending on how many enemies you hit, you might almost immediately have leap back, so maybe you'll leap again. Then you'll ground stomp, and then you can leap again. And you can just keep chaining through 3 or 4 of these stomp effects. We can also see here, we have another affix where every time we use a core skill, remember that's going to be our rend. Just to mention enemy, you're going to next charge or leap. So remember, leap here is going to deal a bunch of extra damage. Big deal there. This one doesn't have anything to do with our build, but it's just nice. You'll see dust doubles coming off of me as I show you the gameplay here. This is why. So this is going to be the one affix I would say you really should try and find this before you build this. So that's ground stomp is going to create an earthquake. It's like an area of effect around us that's going to deal a bunch of physical damage over 4 seconds. While you're in the earthquake, you also deal extra damage. There is an alternate version of this for leap, which I have on my helmet here, which does basically the same thing, except this is a damage reduction field. So when you're in it, you're taking less damage. You're going to want both of these. That's kind of what drives the build. And I have good news and I have bad news. Good news, the leap one here comes out of a dungeon. Bad news, the ground stomp one does not come out of a dungeon. You're going to have to find this one. So keep an eye out for this affix. If you see it, you don't have to keep the item. You can rip the aspect out and just hold on to it. But make sure you're keeping track of one of these. Try and hold on to it as long as you can. Because this is one of those ones that you have to find at RNG, and it's really required for specific builds, this being one of them. Other things we have on, I have a weapon mastery aspect on my boots. This makes it so I have an extra charge of my weapon mastery skills, which in this case is going to be Rupture. And then I also have it dealing a chance to stun when I use it. I've played weapon mastery skills without this aspect before. I did not like it. Now, Deathblow is fine because Deathblow caches itself back in, but if you're not using Deathblow, if you're using Chains or Rupture, I don't like how it feels when I don't have the second charge, so I would keep an eye out for that where you can. I also have just basic skills, so your standard left-click skills give me basic damage reduction, and then I do have some other uniques on that aren't a huge part of this build. So one of them I have Gores on. Gores is a whirlwind gloves. You don't need to have these. You can have any gloves you want on. I just happen to have these on. Don't worry about that. But I do also have a Rage of Harrogath. Rage is very good, and it ties well with our build, even though it doesn't necessarily part of our build, right? So it's not necessarily a part for our build. The build works fine without it, but it does give us that extra bit of cooldown on non-ultimate skills, so it makes it a lot easier for us to keep rotating through all of these things we're doing with the leaps and the stomps and everything else. So that's kind of the build as we have it now. I'm just going to run through part of this dungeon quick. I just want to show you what the gameplay loop looks like. And then we'll go and we'll make some changes. We'll go back to a shout version and we'll look at what shouts look like and all of that, but those will be other videos. So I'm just going to take you through a gameplay demo of this quick, show you what this looks like, and consider it as something you might want to try playing around with. Okay, so we're going to leap in. Oh, he walked away. I'm going to stomp on him. Do some rends. Make our blood pool. Do that. Cash in his bleed, and he's dead. And that's kind of what this looks like. There's really not a whole lot else to what's going on here. You're basically just casting skills, doing things, and standing in earthquakes. You see how those earthquakes there? Those are what you're really making this build out of. That's really what you're here for. Otherwise, like I said, you can do this with shouts, but those earthquakes are the only reason you'd want to not be running shouts, in my opinion. I don't think charge or kick are good enough. I think it has to be those earthquakes, in my opinion. Gonna leap on him, doing stomp. He's gonna work our way, so we're gonna leap on him again. Get our bleeds going. And there we go. So yeah, go ahead and give something like this a try. See if it feels good to you, and let me know how it goes in the comments. Okay, hey everyone, Shroom here. Just wanted to go ahead and do a follow-up on the previous video we did about the Shoutless Barb. I've gone ahead here and moved it over to a build that utilizes shouts, and I just wanted to kind of go through what's different. So you may remember, looking at the skill tree before, what we were doing is we were pretty heavy on ground stomp and leap, and then earthquakes created by ground stomp and leap, in order to be able to constantly have fields around us that are buffing our damage, buffing our damage reduction, and then just dealing some damage over time to enemies. This is a pretty mobile build, and it's very high APM relative to some other barb builds, because you're basically using all of your skills constantly all the time, over and over and over again. What we've done here is we're still on a Rupture build, just because we keep getting that stupid unique sword. That's the Fields of Crimson. But I wanted to go back to using shouts, just because it felt better. It felt like it was a more consistent way to stay alive, more consistent way to heal myself, and just a better way of kind of playing the game, right? So the build here is basically the same. We're still on Flay, with Enhanced Flay and Battle Flay. And if you want to know why I'm using Flay over Lunging Strike, mostly it's because I don't think Lunging Strike is necessary, and I'm trying to lead into build as hard as I can. We still have Rend here, and we're still using 3 points in Pressure Point. For Rend, we're still on Violent Rend, because we want to lean into Vulnerable. A lot of our build is around making things vulnerable and dealing that extra crit damage. We are using Shouts this time. The two Shouts I think are most important are Challenging Shout and Rallying Cry. Challenging Shout has been nerfed, but it's still very strong. It's still a ton of damage reduction, which is really just hard to ignore. And then Rallying Cry is obviously our main generator. No passes on this node. Previously we had Outburst and Tough as Nails filled in. I didn't really think those were doing a whole lot, so I've dropped those. We did fill in all of our passives for our shouts, so we're healing when we're shouting, we're making enemies deal less damage when we're shouting, and our shouts last longer. We don't have any points in Warcry. It's because there's just no room in our bar if we're using both an ult and Rupture. But I do think that Warcry, or the triple shout build, if you will, is also quite strong, and actually that's what I would use if you're on something like Whirlwind, where you're all in on your core skill. I would definitely be using Warcry as your third ability, rather than something like a Rupture or a Death Blow. If we look over here, we're still all in on Rupture. This is again because of Fields of Crimson. It's going to cause Rupture to also make a blood pool that does a bunch of damage, and makes it so that bleeds do more damage as well. It's just very strong. So we're all in on Rupture, and we've got a ton of extra points. 4 of those are from Field of Crimson itself. The rest are from incidental points I have on some other gear. We do still have 1 point in Hamstring, but we don't have it maxed out. This is because generally all we're looking for is the fact that the bleeds do slow. We don't really care how much it slows by. I also have 2 points in Cut to the Bone, just so we have more damage to vulnerable enemies. I still have a point in Exposed Vulnerability, still have a point in No Mercy, and I have 3 points in Pit Fighter. Again, I think every build should have 3 points in Pit Fighter. Looking at our ult tree, we still have 3 points in Heavy Handed, and we're still on Wrath of the Berserker. Iron Maelstrom isn't really useful unless you're all in on weapon swapping, and Call of the Ancients, for me, has fallen off. I think that I'm getting more out of Wrath, but really that's kind of a personal choice in my opinion. And then finally, for our key passive, we are still on Gushing Wounds. Again, it says we're leading into bleeding, and we want to do that extra damage to bleeding and vulnerable enemies as part of this build. There's an argument for Unbridled Rage, but personally, I think Unbridled Rage makes more sense for some of the more damage-forward core skills, that being Hammer of the Ancients, Whirlwind, and Upheaval. In terms of gear, we're still on Fields of Crimson. I think that's, you probably want that before you're running a Rupture build. If you don't have Fields of Crimson but still want to do something like this, I would use Deathblow instead. And then you'd also don't necessarily want to lean into bleeding as much. I would probably do like Lunging Strike and maybe Upheaval. I think is personally my favorite core skill that isn't Whirlwind. In terms of affixes, I have one here that makes my shouts passively generate Fury, and then I also have my shout cooldowns reduced you know, when I cast other shouts. That, along with the effect on Rage of Harrogath, is really making my cooldowns very short. It's making me have a lot of uptime on my shouts. Now, I'm not going to get my shouts down to the point where they're like 100% uptime. They still only last about 7.5 seconds. Their cooldown is still, I think, 20 seconds? It's 25 seconds. So even if I knocked that down a whole bunch by maximum values, we're still talking somewhere in the area of like 3 times the cooldown of it being up. But it is still quite powerful, and we do want to get those as short as possible. Gores isn't doing anything for us here. I just happen to have them on. For our helmet, basically what we did here is we just put on things we had that weren't the earthquakes. So these are all just basic, general, kind of good stuff things. I do still have the weapon mastery boots on. I think those are really important. If you can find this anywhere, please do use it. If you're using a Deathblow build, if you're using a Rupture build, you really need these Weapon Master Greaves, or wherever the slot you can get this aspect on. Unfortunately, I do not believe this aspect is available through a dungeon, so you are going to have to find it in the wild, but however, once you do, hold on to it for dear life and never let it go. And then, yeah, we do also have a hammer here that gives us an extra damage on our weapon mastery skill, so in this case our Rupture, after we've spent 100 Fury. So this should hopefully make our Rupture much more powerful as well. So I'm actually interested to play with this. I didn't have a chance to give this a try yet. I'm really excited to. We also swapped out some more options. So basically we took all the earthquake things off, and here we are. And I just want to compare this to what we were doing before. This is actually the same dungeon we were in, and we're going to see how this goes. Shouts. Let's see, look how much fury we have now. Like, I'm not even doing anything. Look how much fury we have. This is definitely a build where excess fury aspects can work. Really anything with shouts can do that. I left a prisoner here. So you'll notice I'm taking a lot less damage. What damage I am taking is being healed back basically immediately. I have bottomless fury, just about. I just think that if you're looking at what benefits am I getting out of my build, I just think that a shout build, even as a 2-shout build like this, is just significantly better than anything you could be doing with Ground Stomp or a Leap. And you saw that I did my best to build into those. I just don't think that those are going to be the way to go, especially when we get into later game and there's less tolerance for looseness in your build. That's all I really had to say. I just wanted to compare the two builds and show you what they kind of look like differently. I know I didn't spend as much time on the shout build, but the shout builds are everywhere. That's all everyone's recommending, so I figured that everyone's probably more familiar with those than the Leap and Ground Stomp build. Just wanted to kind of show you what the differences were and see what you thought about it. So go ahead and leave notes in the comments if you have any questions for me, if you have any comments, if there's anything you'd like me to demo on the stream, I'm happy to. I don't have the setup I want for the weapon swapping build yet, but I will try and hold on to pieces for it so we can play with it before we get to Season 1. Looking forward to seeing what other options are out there for Barbarian builds. And I just want to say again, I'm not dissing the 3-shout Whirlwind build. I think that's probably the strongest build for Barbarian right now. It's been receiving nerfs, and it's still the strongest build for Barbarian, and it's probably going to be what we're going to spend all of Season 1 on at least. I just wanted to go ahead and make sure we gave everything else a try and made sure we looked at all the other options available to us before we get to that season and feel like we're kind of locked in. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. You have a great day.